Excellent. Welcome back, everybody. Yeah, a couple of things, points of business. First of all, this is being recorded, and we will post that as soon as possible, and we'll send a note out to everybody that registered once we have got those videos up. That'll be on the conference YouTube channel. If you want to ask questions of the speaker, so Micah is going to be our next speaker, you can do it through the Q&A there, and well, since I'm moderating this session, I'll try to pass it along, those questions along to Micah when he's done. Before we get there, a couple more of the raffles for folks. So some previous winners, I'll just go through these somewhat slowly here, and we'll be sending out stuff. Thanks again to the wonderful donations from our sponsors and some of those teams. So that's really great. And I think Connie is our next winner. And so that's great. Another winner from Ottawa. That is really nice. And I think that's a Flyers ball cap, so that's great. I'll do a couple more here real quick. Chad from Buffalo, so super for Chad. That's great. What we've got slated in that spot is a women's small St. Lawrence hockey shorts. Maybe we'll give you an opportunity to choose that or choose not. We'll see. And let's do one more, and then I'll introduce Micah. So Paul from Kingston, congratulations. And in that spot, I think a Winnipeg Jets cap is headed your way. So awesome. All right, our next speaker is Micah Blake McCurdy. Micah's a mathematician who likes pictures. He runs a website, hockeyviz.com, where he stores his pictures, mostly about hockey. He lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Micah.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Just before I put slides up, I have to say thank you very much to Rachel Dory, who gave me the tiara for the occasion. Many of you who know me will know that it is my inexplicable habit. I have tiaras. My children don't believe that I use them for work, and so they play with them and they break them. It makes me feel very sad. So I have some things to show you about ice position. In particular, I have discovered that some of my old work that I presented at this conference 5 years ago, was wrong, and so I decided to fix it. And so it's called ice position again, because it's the same thing I looked at my very first time at this conference. And so these are the opening 2 slides from that conference where I said, can players affect their team results by gaining or losing territory? And I concluded, not really. Not only is the conclusion wrong, what's much more important is that the question is wrong. It is, and as I've realized, as I've started to do a lot more work, can players do something? Is the wrong way to frame anything, is a binary way of thinking. The correct way of framing things is, how much do players affect their team results? Instead of asking yes/no questions, ask measure questions. And then you ask yourself, what is the correct way to measure this? And then you say, well, can I measure it in that correct way or in a correct way? And then you can ask yourself, have I done so? And I get a totally different answer. In fact, a fair bit. Precisely how much you'll have to wait and see for. We'll get to the actual numbers later, but it turns out that once you quantify it properly, and I feel like I've come within an inch of doing it properly, in fact, the impact that players can have on the position of the puck on the ice is quite substantial, not just for their own shifts, but in a residual way. So I've spent a lot of time talking about on ice impact. And there's going to be a tiny scrap of that here, but mostly what I'm looking at today is how much can players impact the shifts that follow their shifts? And what is that actually worth? So this is off ice impact. How much is that guy who just finished his shift helping or hurting the team based on what he's consistently doing or not doing during his shift? So that's the that's the angle. And I'm going to tell you some of the methodological weaknesses in the way that I'm approaching this, in particular, why I feel like if they could be corrected, and I feel sadly better data will be needed, why I think I might actually be underestimating this effect. And you'll decide for yourself if you believe me or not. So the approaches that I'm looking at transitions, specifically blue line transitions, they're obviously important parts of the rink where the rules change. There are specific blue line rules. There are red line rules too, but they're not nearly as important. So the blue lines separate the rink into 3 areas, and moving the puck across them and stopping your opponent from moving the puck across them is, in some sense, a vital part of the game. In some sense, there's the animating thought behind a lot of the original sort of Corsi wars back in the day, was trying to get at using shots as a proxy for blue line stuff, as a proxy for possession, as a proxy for controlling play, which was deliberately erasing shot quality distinctions. That's sort of neither here nor there, a bit of history. But obviously everybody still cares about blue line work. And this is a different angle on it. Specifically exits and exit defense, that's moving from the defensive zone into the neutral zone. And exit defense is trying to stop your opponent from doing just that. And so that's all the idea is there is that you're talking about getting into the neutral zone. And then there's entries and entry defense, and entry is getting out of the neutral zone into your opponent's offensive zone. And so again, the angle there is from the neutral zone going out. So the model I decided to apply here is a logistic regression with terms, with a variety of terms. Logistic regression just means yes-no regression. So it's not based on predicting a number, it's based on predicting a thing happening or not. And so it's very useful for goal scoring, where every time you take a shot, you either score or you don't. And so, but here the application is a little bit weirder. In fact, sort of nerdier nerds than me will already be saying, why are you doing this? Why aren't you using something like a Poisson regression or a Cox proportional hazards model or something? And the answer is because I don't know how. In fact, the Wolfram asked a question ahead of time that I didn't have a chance to answer, where he asked me why I don't have a nice hexagonal zoom background. And the answer is that I'm bad at computers and I couldn't make it work. But I tried, so now you know. The logistic regression terms that I was using, I decided to look at just 5-on-5 play, just in the NHL, just in this year and the previous year. So those are constants for the rest of the talk. 5 guys collectively trying to accomplish a transition. 5 players who want, whether they have the puck or not. If the puck is in your zone, whether you have it or not, you want to get it out. And if the puck is in your opponent's zone, you want to keep it there. So you have 5 players trying to make a transition happen, either an entry or an exit, and 5 players trying to prevent it. And so depending on where you are, where you are on the ice, that determines if you're taking up an offensive or a defensive position in my model, not anything to do with puck location, which I don't have. I also include some score details. So everything I do has like a score effect angle, and that's going to be some interesting stuff here too. The time in the game as well, because we know that affects how coaches and players make their decisions, and some interactions between them because of some, if any of you followed my ill-fated trip to get to Columbus, the research I presented when I finally got there full of cortisol was about how leading teams drive score effects, which is entirely consistent with what we saw in Megan Schlegel's talk earlier on in the keynote, where the research that came out of her team showed a lot more detail than the sort of broad stuff that I was talking about in Columbus last year. And so we're going to look at some score interactions here too. And then I also threw in some team variables. Normally I would be a little bit more sophisticated and actually use the names of coaches so that I could keep track of coaching stuff, as coaches change. And I decided for simplicity, I would just use teams. Only looking at a couple seasons for now, and there haven't been very many coaching changes. So those are the terms that are going to go into the model. Those are the things that I'm going to be interested in measuring the effect of, but the effect on, like I said, it's a logistic regression, so it's a yes-no regression. And so each observation, I have an observation for every second. And so for the exit model, strictly speaking, it's 2 different models, although the terms are the same, the underlying data and the response variables are not. So for the exit model, an observation for every second that the puck is in your zone, is in a defensive zone, because after all, it could come out in the next second, or it could not. And if it does come out in the following second, then that's a success for the transition team. And if it does not come out, if the team trying to defend the transition succeeds in defending the transition, then I'm going to code that as 0. So it's a yes or no about transition. And so to give you an idea, in the data set that I looked at in this year and last year, there were 92,000 such 5-on-5 seconds. 92,000 transitions out of the defensive zone into the neutral zone, and 3.7 million attempts. So about 2.5% is your chance on every given second. And that's treating the seconds as independent, which is obviously wrong, but I did it anyway. The entry model is the same idea, only instead of using the in-zone seconds as the data, I'm using the neutral zone seconds as the data. And then the target is a success if in the next second it's in an in-zone play, if it's moved across a blue line. And that's a success for the people who are trying to move it across and a failure for the people who are trying to stop it from going across. There are more transitions, there's more entries than there are exits, about 9,000 more in that time period, and not nearly as many attempts. The puck simply is not in the neutral zone as much as it is in the two offensive zones. And so there's a 6.1% success rate. And then, of course, strictly speaking, I fitted both of these models in both directions at the same time using the same data. So every second that the puck was in the neutral zone, you got to be, 5 of the guys get to be the attackers in one direction and the other 5 the defenders in that direction. And then the same thing again, only flipped, because I'm looking at transitions over both blue lines all at the same time. So I actually have quite a few models going on at the same time with the same data. But there's 4 things to be considered. There's entries, entry defense, exits, exit defense. So we're trying to look at all 4 of them all at once. And of course, you might wonder, shouldn't they match up? After all, where does the puck go? Like some sort of conservation of puck rule. Surely the entries and the exits should match, but of course they don't quite, because sometimes you score. And when you do, the puck is miraculously transported to the neutral zone by omniscient beings, and you don't have to get a zone exit. And in particular, I definitely did not want to code that as a zone exit. That is not a success for the 5 players who are trying to get the puck out of their zone. And also, in fact, even more important than goals, the periods just stop. And then when you start again, you don't have to start again where the puck was. You start at center ice. And so there's not as many exits as there are entries. Another thing however, there are other ways. In the play-by-play data that I'm using, I don't have really fine-grained data. I'm imputing all of these transitions, all of these puck locations, I'm imputing from existing play-by-play data, which is very doable, as any of you who have tried to do it will know, and is also contains a lot of flaws where, I am missing times where pucks are cleared out and then immediately put back into the zone, where if I don't get a play-by-play event when the puck is in the neutral zone, I'm not coding that as an exit followed by an entry, like I want to. In fact, in principle, the puck can move a great deal without events being recorded. So I know that there's missing data here, and I'm just making do with what I've got. There you go. What can you do about that? So this is the only really technical slide. How I did it is I took that model of those terms and that data and that response variable. I fitted a logistic regression model with ridge penalties. So that means I'm biasing every term towards 0, because after all, there are terms for every player, and some players hardly play at all. And and if one guy, one poor soul, got to play like 2 shifts in his all NHL career and he spent them entirely in his defensive zone, he'd come out looking like a complete black hole, unless you had some sort of penalty to bias everybody towards average. Some extra shenanigans to make sure that all the score terms pool out the right way you want. Technical chicanery of various kinds that describes kind of the whole endeavor. We'll get into those hideous details, if you like, later. So one of the first things you discover is that once you've got those probabilities, you can calculate an average time to transition. How long does the puck, on average, stay in the defensive zone once it's there? And the answer is 27 seconds. And then you can calculate the same thing for entries, and it's much smaller. The puck just does not stay in the neutral zone like it stays in the end zones, which makes perfect sense from a purely physical perspective. There's boards on the end, on one end of each of the defensive zones, and there aren't on the neutral zone. Not to mention it's smaller. Neither here nor there. So let's get to some results first of all. The metric here, coefficients from logistic regressions are kind of a pain to interpret, so I've done a lot of jiggery-pokery to make them easier to interpret. And so here, when you see the bars going up, that is the effect on the time until a particular transition. So these are structural terms for exits. So that the biggest, most obvious one is the +3. So that says that when you are the team that is up by 3 or more goals, it takes you 15% longer to get out of your zone than normal. The average, like we just saw, is about 27 seconds. And so 15% is about 4 seconds. And so you can expect to spend, on average, another 4 seconds in your zone every single time the puck is in your zone. Here, the score effect is extremely simple. When you're losing, it's easy to get the puck out of your zone, which is perfectly consistent with what we've seen from my own previous research, as well as from Megan's research that she presented this morning. When your team is faster than the puck, guys are sagging. They're not attacking to defend the offensive blue line the same way that they would if they weren't winning. So when you're losing, it's easier and quicker to get out of the zone, and as you begin to trail, it's easier and easier and easier to get out of the zone. The period effect is the same thing. It's easier to get out of your zone in the first and second period, harder to get out of your zone in the first and second period, and easier. No, I was right the first time. Harder to get out, it takes longer, up is longer. Home teams have it slightly easier than away teams. And then the interaction terms, so those are just terms to catch nonlinear effects. So in the third period, if you are up 1 or up 2, which is specifically the terms, or tied, those are the 3 terms that I chose to look at because they were the 3 terms that turned out to be significant from my research on score effects on shots. Then again, you can see another, and these add roughly linearly, you can expect another 10% tacked on. So if you were playing in the third period and you were up by 2, for instance, you would have to add all 3 of those things. Up 2 is 5%, third period, another 6 or 7%. Up to in the third period, another 11 or 12%. And so all of a sudden now you're spending, which I'm sure all of us have seen, if you are winning late, you are spending a lot of time in your own zone. You are not getting the puck out. So for entries, then the pattern is a little bit different. If you want to actually, and so now again, the up bars means it's taking you longer to do the transition. So actually getting across the offensive blue line takes longer when you're winning. The entry defense gets a lot better. Unusually here, it's not linear with respect to score. Here, when it's tied scores are the scores that are clogged up in the neutral zone, where it's hard to get out of the neutral zone into the attacking zone for both teams, which again lines up with what we know. I did this to try to measure player effects, but I'm spending a lot of time on the structural effects because I'm always drawn to, it's nice to work on player evaluation, and I love it, and I do a lot of it, but I'm persistently drawn towards what does this tell us about the game? What does this tell us about the league as a whole? This is one of those places where I would love to have the kind of data as well as the kind of technical infrastructure that I have in place for the NHL in place for other leagues. So I could say something like, this is what it's like to play in the NHL, but this is what it's like to play in this other league. Notice the structural details are different. It's not just that the players are more skilled or less skilled or what have you. It's that they play different. You can actually see that the leagues are stylistically different. And so here there's a difference between entries and exits, which is interesting, where scores away from 0, winning or losing, makes it harder to actually get an entry. And here again, the period behavior is again different. Second period, the entries come easier. In the third period, they're tougher. And so which matches again what we see from more chaotic second periods. Home teams have it a little bit easier again. And here the score interactions are much, much milder. And so that again tells you something interesting about score effects. It tells you that it's not just that it's leading teams that are driving score effects, it's leading teams that are driving score effects, and they primarily affect exits much more than they affect entries. So that's team stuff. Let's take a look at some player stuff. I try not to kind of minimize the amount of lists I make, even though people like them. But I feel like I ought to give you some sort of insight into which players have the best results. And so here I want to reiterate, just while we linger on this slide, I want to reiterate that the approach is diffuse, where the idea is that the logic behind the model says all 5 of the players on one side of the puck are all trying to get the puck out. And I'm not looking at any details of events apart from where they happen. Not looking at hits, not looking at passes, not looking at shots, not looking at any play-by-play details except for where was it. And in particular, I'm having no tracking whatsoever about who is carrying the puck, who is supporting the puck, who is throwing hits to get the puck, who is throwing hits that don't serve any purpose, who is making passes to the other team. Is very diffuse in the sense that you don't get to know at this level precise mechanisms of any kind. There's no correlations with stats whatsoever. Not even correlations with play-by-play stats, except for locations. So it's just when you are on the ice, do good things happen or do bad things happen, with the tacit assumption that everybody is in principle affecting the play, all 10 of the people on the ice. And that sort of, we know that that's wrong in some broad sense. Not every player is affecting play as much as every other player. In particular, puck carriers, we would naturally expect would have a substantial impact on these kinds of things. But I deliberately chose this diffuse method anyway, because I wanted to be sure that I was catching, however broadly, however vaguely, I wanted to be sure I was catching everything. If you don't cast a broad net, then if you only look at puck carriers, then a guy could be a great puck carrier, but he's going to have terrible exit stats because he doesn't get the puck, because his opponents don't support him, or his teammates don't support him. Or you can imagine 1,000 permutations of that kind of thinking, where I want to be able to catch everything, so I have to, in principle, let it be there to be caught. And the price for that is an approach which is a little bit more diffuse, which opens up even more questions of like, well, why does that guy have great numbers, or why does that guy have terrible numbers? And then connecting that up to video, connecting that up, if I ever got trapped in a bar with a player who wanted to know exactly why he looked bad in some graph of mine, in addition to calling for help in a loud voice, I would have to take pains to explain that getting a hold of what is so interesting to me that I'm prepared to sacrifice a lot of details about why and defer those details, filling in those details to people who are expert in those matters, to coaches, in fact. But that said, let's look at some players who are best at impacting their team's exits. And so Matt Barzal is no surprise at the top, the best in this year and the past year at getting the puck out, at causing the Islanders to get the puck out of their own zone. And the timing there, notice the magnitude there, 14%, decreasing the amount of time the Islanders sit in their own zone by 14% is about as big as any of those structural terms. And so you're looking at several seconds shaved off the average in-zone time. Matt Tkachuk is Flames player, also extremely, this is one of those things that if you watch him, he's very good at. Nick Ehlers, one of the Jets' best players, not even remotely surprising. I'm also, just for extremely silly reasons, always pleased when I see former Mooseheads lighten it up in the NHL stage. We were extremely spoiled for a stretch there. Adam Fox is also extremely unsurprising. Jaden Schwartz, perhaps a little bit unheralded, despite being a fixture on the Blues first line for years now. Those are the top 5 in this year and last year taken together. So far, no surprises. Now, what about entries? So I'm doing the offensive bests first. Matt Barzal, again, he's the only name who crops up multiple times in this particular talk. But then after that, a lot of the remaining names are not particularly, not the kinds of people you would pick out of a highlight list. Travis Konechny, obviously, well-known flyer, but a lot of those other players are not famous names by any means. And which is part of what is interesting to me about this, because like I said earlier, what I'm trying to get at is not just on ice impact, which I feel like I'm already getting a reasonably good handle on with my existing stuff, but I want to get a handle on what players who might not have the kind of playmaking in-zone abilities to either make really nice passes, to set up really nice chances, to take away really nice chances, or to shoot the puck themselves really well. What can they do to leave the ice in a good place, in a better place for their teammates who take the shift after them? That's what I'm really trying to get at. And so obviously one of the things that you can do if you don't have those in-zone skills, which generate shots and chances and take them away, one of the things you can do is you can just move the puck up the ice. And so there's a handful of names that I'm going to highlight, which are players who are doing that very well, who aren't going to be on the score sheet themselves. That's part of one of the animating joys for me in analytics, is being able to say, well, existing things give these people credit really well. Who is actually helping the team but isn't getting credit? How can I make sure they get it? And so those three, just for being in a top five, are less expected. And then defensively, on the other side of the puck, here again, the magnitudes are broadly similar. Marty Ferk, another ex-Moosehead, looking extremely strong. Love to see it. But these are players who are good at keeping the puck in the offensive zone once it's already there. It's not quite the same thing as zone entries. And again, the list of names, Mikko Rantanen is obviously extremely good. Philip Danault is well known defensively, and this is specifically quantifying defense in the offensive zone, keeping the puck from coming back down the ice, ratcheting it in place. Also, interestingly, is Christian Wolanin there. Christian Wolanin just cleared waivers yesterday, and he's a player that if you don't pay attention to the Senators and who should, you might not know him very well. But he's an extremely up tempo, which I say with joy, defender, plays absolutely hair on fire hockey, and his total impact on ice is pretty average once you net it all out. He generates a lot of offense for the Senators. He permits quite a bit of offense to their opponents. But this is consistent with that, where he's very good at taking the kinds of risks that keep the puck in the zone once it's there. There's a particular way to make a mark. And so I realize that I'm kind of in the weeds a little bit in the sense of isolating something small. You would never look at somebody having a really good rank on this sort of stat and say, well, that guy's clearly one of the best guys in the league. The on-ice impact, I think, is always going to be much, much larger. In fact, you'll see in a moment just how much smaller this is. But part of why I like it is that it gets at something where you're having an impact on the game, and that impact happens when you're not on the ice. So one of the things that you can do if you have a chap like Wolanin who plays for you is that you, as a coach, you can keep his shifts even shorter than you might by changing him off once you get an offensive zone faceoff, knowing that one of the things that he'll get for you is in the future is more offensive zone faceoffs. And then best at preventing entries to complete the set of four. So these are guys who are not letting you into their zone. And here the top five are all forwards, which is a little bit surprising to me, although a little bit less surprising once you look at specifically which forwards they are. Alex Steen, an excellent defensive forward for the Blues. Casey Cizikas is a huge part of why the Islanders are so incredibly stingy at giving up chances per minute, is that they don't let opponents into the zone. And Cizikas is a great example of that. All of the others were top five. Here I included the top six precisely because Jared Spurgeon happened to be the sixth best at this, and I wanted the Youngren twins to be happy with me. So that's that. That's just some, it's always nice to look at who's at the top of stuff, but really we want to know the relationships between the things. After all, you'd expect a lot of these things would correlate. In particular, if I had really fine-grained data on when the puck is coming out and when the puck is going back in, I was expecting to see certain players, certain correlations appear, where I was expecting that certain players would be particularly good at getting the puck out, but very bad at stopping it from coming back in, the kind of high off the glass tropes. Although one of the nice things is that I didn't see that, and there isn't as much of it in the NHL now as there was. Maybe if I looked at older data, I would see a lot more of that. So here I have a little schematic diagram, and the hard lines indicate correlations. So I put the offensive terms on the top, The exit offense, how much you can get out of your own zone, and then the entry offense, how much you can get into the next zone. Those are reasonably highly correlated. 0.4 is pretty high for any kind of social sciences data. So being good offensively in one part of the ice, moving the puck up the ice, correlates strongly to doing it out one blue line and doing it again in the next blue line. Similarly, defense is also fairly strongly correlated with itself. So exit defense and entry defense correlate pretty well. Again, almost 0.4. The really surprising thing to me, there's a number among the many really surprising things, is the very high correlation, 0.54, between entry offense and entry defense. Something about chaos in the neutral zone. So entry defense here, notice the way that I drew the arrows. So this is the puck moving in the direction that you want it to from the neutral zone is correlated with the puck also moving in the direction you don't want it to in the neutral zone. So there's some sort of correlation there that suggests that it's being driven by people taking risks, that the way you get entries is by taking risks, and when they don't work, you give up entries. So that, 0.54 might not be particularly impressive if you're doing, I don't know, physics, but in hockey terms, it's really quite high. And then, but then the really interesting thing is that everywhere you don't see a solid line, I only indicated 3 correlations on this graph, and that's because all of the others, 1, 2, 3 others, all of the other correlations are 0, are extraordinarily close to 0, not even worth mentioning. And that, none of those facts is particularly bizarre in its own right. But if there's a high correlation across the top of this graph and a high correlation down the right-hand side, would you not expect there to be a correlation between the top left and the bottom right, and similarly between the bottom left and the top right? And the reason why that can happen is that, and here's something really interesting about the sport, I think, you all can decide what you think is interesting, is that because there isn't a correlation in those diagonal spots, that's telling you that the players who are driving the correlation between offense and offense are not the same players as the ones who are driving the correlation between entry offense and entry defense. So the people who are doing chaotic things in the neutral zone are not the same people as the ones who are extremely skilled or extremely unskilled at moving the puck up the ice, and again, are not the same people as the ones who are especially good or especially bad, the ones who are driving the correlation between exit defense and entry defense. So those correlations, the fact that they exist is interesting. The pattern that they fall in is itself extremely interesting to me. And so I'm very close to out of time. So I thought I would give you an idea of how a very quick run through of how I actually turned this into something that I could compare to on-ice impact. So if you can make a transition matrix that shows the probabilities of moving from this zone to that zone. So by definition, I decided to make the D to O and the O to D transitions to be 0, where I imputed, I said, if you're going to move the puck from, like if I had a play-by-play data set that looked like the puck went straight from the defensive zone to the offensive zone, I just inserted a neutral zone second in there. I'm doing minor violence to my data to make it more consistent. And then those 4 terms in red are precisely the terms that we're trying to model. D to N, N to D, O to N, N to O, those are the transitions that we're interested in. And so those are the averages, the league averages that we saw before, 2.5% success on exits and 6.1% on entries. And then you can look at a specific player, and so they modify slightly, throw in McDavid just for argument's sake. They change, that looks like a tiny change, 2.5 to 2.7, 2.5 to 2.4. And of course they're different because now he's on 2 different sides of the puck and he has 2 different terms, one for offense, one for defense. And then of course, the probabilities have to add up to 1, so you can just insert the numbers that make them add up to 1 in those spots, and now you have a transition matrix. This is McDavid's impact on the puck in a given second. And so if you want to know what happens, what McDavid's impact is over many seconds, you can just apply that transition matrix many times to a league average pattern where you say this many defensive zone starts, this many neutral zone starts, this many offensive zone starts. Some additional technical chicanery I won't get into with what I did with the on-the-fly starts, but you can do that. You can basically say, what happens if we put the puck and McDavid and 9 other dudes on the ice? What happens? We'll just pretend we evolve our simulation, if you like, 90 times. It turns out, at first I went through all these hoops about, how many seconds should I use? Because after all, once you take a lot of seconds, you're going to converge to the steady state of this thing. Turns out it doesn't matter. NHL shift lengths are long enough in this sense that you can just run them to infinity if you like, and you'll get the long-term behavior. Or you can just take 45, it makes no odds. Once you do that, you can get an impact of what a given player is doing on puck position, and then you can multiply those impacts according to what an offensive zone an offensive zone shift start, not quite the same thing, what an offensive zone shift start and a defensive zone shift start are worth in terms of shots. And I have that for my other model. Here's one I made earlier. You multiply them together and you get off-ice impact. And so then you can throw them all in a big heap and see what you get. And so what you get is a range of off-ice impacts. So this is how much players are affecting the shifts that come after their shifts, with no indication, nothing about what happens when they're on the ice, except how they affect where the puck ends compared to where it starts. And so you get a roughly bell curve shaped thing, which runs from about -1.5% to +1.5%, which in its face is not particularly large. It's about a tenth of the size of the on-ice impact distribution. And just to give you an idea, I used McDavid in the little walkthrough there, and so I figure I should label him for you also, so you see he's there, very close to the front of the distribution. He didn't hit the top 5 in any of those 4 categories, but when you take all 4 of them and wrap them up and try to actually measure them in some sort of impact, then you get then you see he's very close to the top of the distribution, like you'd hope and expect. And so, like I said, it's about 10% of the impact. And so you can have your impact on shots by making your team take shots, or by preventing the other team from taking shots while you're on the ice. But just from the position you gain or don't gain, you get another tenth of that, roughly, taken across the league in the following shifts. So you have, if you want to have like a model that you can use to take away, you should think that some players are getting sheltered minutes, some players are getting the opposite, are getting tough minutes, but the coach is giving those minutes out to the players. And so then the obvious question is, who is giving those minutes to the coach to give them to the other players? And so now we have some way of actually getting a partial answer for that. Which players are the ones who are taking resources away from their team by forcing their coach to use up their defensive players on defensive zone shifts? And who is giving those resources to their coaches so that players who have a better chance of scoring will get cushy minutes? Who's giving their coach lots of opportunities that way? And so obviously there's a lot of future work to be done. You can kind of tell I was a bit loosey-goosey in a handful of places. The most immediate, obvious future work thing to me is, like I said, I was doing it diffusely without looking at specific details, like who is carrying the puck, who is trying to give exit passes, who is entry assisting, like all of those things. But Corey Snyder and so I haven't made any attempt to synchronize that together. But if you wanted to really bring this to a coach, you absolutely should be doing that. And so that's a big undertaking. That's a lot of data to wrangle. Now we have 2 big data sets to wrangle together. So there's obviously more future work to do than that, but I just highlighted the most prominent one. And so that's the most obvious future direction. And then of course there's the sort of give it the full glossy treatment where I do it from year to year with the chained impacts and all the rest of it. But we'll get to that, I think, in the summer. But that's all for me. I went slightly over time. I apologize. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for that, Micah. I've got a couple of questions. I think I'm only going to be able to get to one of them. But the question was about data from other leagues. And if you had data from other leagues to evaluate those structural differences, do you think that would improve your ability to isolate player ability and perform as they transition from one league to another?
Absolutely. For instance, you could, if you had the kind of data, just even this play-by-play data like I was using here, if you had that same data for, I don't know, an SHL, bunch of games, if you could say to somebody, look, he has these scoring results, but in particular, which are maybe not so impressive, but his entries are extraordinary. Even though he personally doesn't score very well, if you could bring that to a coach when you say we're going to move this guy over, and you can say these are his specific skills, you could identify that from video the same way as you could identify it from analytics, but any way you identify it, if you can bring that to a coach and say, these are the skills we've isolated that we feel will come over, don't expect scoring, instead expect this, all of a sudden your team rates go up that pathway seems very clear to me.
Awesome. I'm going to indulge my own interest here. Can you go back to the slide with McDavid and Provorov?
Yes.
And so I think several people would like to know who are at the very ends of those tails.
So the chap at the high point on the tail is Joel Kiviranta, which is perhaps a little bit surprising. But that's one of those things, like, anytime you see an outlier like that, you go back and look and at just raw data, and the long and short of it is he doesn't have crazy scoring numbers, he doesn't have crazy on ice impact numbers, but the puck just winds up the other end of the ice again and again and again and again. I watched, in fact, I was so curious about it, I watched a few of his shifts. I think it's something about conditioning somehow. I think there's some sort of, like, at the end of shifts when other people are tired, he is not. And so he's not getting a lot of impact in his shifts. I mean, there was that one extremely memorable playoff game, but something about being able to still skate the puck all the way up the ice instead of just dumping it in, even at the end of a shift. And so that's just a guess. The people at the other end, Carl Soderberg is at the very bottom, Dahlstrom, Gardner, Gibbons, Mike Stone, Wagner, Borowiecki, Sinishin, Chris Russell. It's more or less a murderer's row of people who are known for other aspects of the game rather than transition. The Provorov I mentioned only because he's very high profile. He has some very obvious strengths and some very obvious weaknesses and a long history of amusing me personally. But it's mostly down that end. It's mostly people who are grinding out marginal careers.
Great. Thank you, Micah, again. Really appreciate that. We are a little behind, but I want to make sure that we have the full hour for the poster sessions. So as we did in the previous poster session, we're going to post a link to the chat. And so you will leave this Zoom and go into the other Zoom. There it is. Shirley just posted it. And you'll be able to move throughout the breakout rooms in that other chat. Appreciate that, and we'll see you back in about an hour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, and I think this officially closes the conference. Everybody have a great night and hope to see you next year.